George Frideric Handel was one of the most powerful figures in classical music. But was he the greatest composer of his time, as Beethoven so passionately proclaimed? In Beethoven's opinion, Handel was greater than Bach, Mozart, Haydn, or even himself. It seems extraordinary that the consummate egotist Beethoven would even suggest that there was someone better than he.
I think one has to put it into a context. And the context is that Beethoven, yes, would have been aware of Handel's music. He would have been considerably less aware of Bach's music.
People listened to music of their own period in those days. They weren't so much concerned about what happened 100 years ago. And it's possible, I don't know how much Beethoven knew about the various Baroque composers, but it's very interesting that he found Handel to be so great. They have something in common. They have something in common. It was said of Bach that he wrote for God, and it's said of Handel that he wrote for the people. And I think you could say of Beethoven, he definitely wrote for the people.
When Beethoven called Handel the greatest composer who ever lived, he was paying one composer's tribute to an earlier composer. I think in his less benign and less humble moments, Beethoven might have felt that he knew of a nominee closer to hand.
George Frideric Handel was born in Halle, Germany in 1685, in the same year as Johann Sebastian Bach. He received his formal training in Italy, returned for a brief stint in Germany, and then crossed the Channel to become one of England's most famous composers. Hang on, it gets better. After his death in 1759, the German-born Handel was entombed in London, in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner, an honor usually reserved for the most eminent of Englishmen. Suffice it to say, Herr Handel got around.
He had a very international kind of career, and in different periods of his life, depending on who his audience was, what the fashions were, and whether he was in Italy or in Germany or in England, he wrote different kinds of music.
He was a sponge who assimilated all of these various styles of music and then created a melange out of them. So within any given piece of music, you can trace French influences, German influences, Italian influences, English influences, because he used what he felt was appropriate at that time.
He was an extraordinary inventor, and I think that that quality has kept his music before us, because there's never a sense of dullness. The amazing speed at which he could write was another thing that people marveled at. The music just poured out of him. You can see it when you look at the manuscripts. Some composers write in a very careful way. He's obviously in a hurry because the ideas are coming out of him almost faster than he can write them down. That's a very rare kind of composer.
So he had a sense of drama, he had a sense of occasion. Therefore, when he was asked to write the water music, as he was, you know, with the barges going down the River Thames at that time, then he was the perfect person to ask to do that, because he could develop this sense of occasion and he could turn it into a big ceremonial happening, and wrote great music at the same time.
He was practical. That really was his great skill. His employer might come to him with this solemn request to write music that could be heard by the king when he was sailing on his barge on the Thames, and lo and behold, he would write music that could be heard by the king from the musicians going along on a barge alongside. Can you imagine what kind of gig that must have been, to actually have been riding on a barge on the Thames going like that, which is a tidal river. It's not exactly an easy river to ride on. And the king going along in all magnificence. Of course, the musicians would have had to have been in all their best finery, and while you were playing, the boat would be rocking like this, so your reed would be in and out of your mouth.
Handel's greatest strength as a composer and a performer was being able to serve the public of his day. When musical tastes changed, he changed with them and wrote music that people wanted to hear.
We seem to forget that he was one of the first great freelancers in music. Having a patron was essentially the way most composers got by. Somebody paid the bills for them, and they returned some music. But Handel had to mount his own productions when he was living in London. He was at various times employed in court situations, but when he was in London, he was Mr. Handel, and he mounted a season at the opera, he mounted his oratorios and so on, arranged for tickets to be sold. He was an impresario as well as a composer, and a very high-level performer as well.
Handel was a brilliant organist, and his improvisational skills were legendary, as are the many anecdotes about his life. One that is often told has Handel ducking into a blacksmith's shop during a thunderstorm and writing a piece inspired by the even beat of the blacksmith's hammer striking his anvil.
He was brought up in an organ environment, church music environment, and to a certain extent an operatic environment in Germany. It wasn't then, of course, known as Germany. But when he went to Italy, he was able to master the art of song.
Handel had successfully introduced Italian opera to England and wrote more than 40 of them. Many are considered masterpieces. One of his most popular operas was Giulio Cesare, based on the story of Julius Caesar. England's love affair with opera eventually cooled, as once again, the public's taste changed.
And he found himself out of work. So what did he do? He wrote oratorios. And then he just adapted with the necessity for change, and suddenly then his oratorios became the rage.
Oratorios, written for solo singers, chorus, and orchestra, are powerful biblical dramas traditionally based on stories from the Old Testament. They are similar to three-act operas, but without any staging, costumes, or action. In England until the 20th century, it was illegal to act a biblical story on stage, hence the popularity of oratorios.
Oratorio was his strategy to tell stories and get away with it without having to act them out on stage. And he used religious subjects because they were popular subjects.
Handel wrote 20 oratorios in his lifetime, none more famous than the Messiah.
The people that walked in darkness, that walked in darkness. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light, have seen a great light. Have seen a great light. The people that walked in darkness, that walked in darkness. The people that walked in darkness.
The Messiah, which lasts over 2 hours and contains about 50 musical numbers, was first performed in 1742 in Dublin, Ireland. It was actually part of a series of benefit concerts for prisoners incarcerated in Dublin jails. Ironically, Handel, at the age of 56, feared that he would end up rotting in a debtor's prison himself. Creditors were knocking at his door, and he really needed a big hit. The Messiah's signature piece, the Hallelujah Chorus, has been described as one of the greatest cries of musical triumph ever written.
One of the remarkable things about Messiah is that it was composed in 3 weeks. It took him 3 weeks to write it. It's the story of Christ, isn't it? It starts with his birth and nativity. It's the passion sequence in the middle, and then it's the resurrection and then revelation of what is to come. So it really runs the gamut. I mean, we perform it at Christmas time. That's sort of become the tradition, but in many ways it's an Easter oratorio as much as a Christmas oratorio. But I think the appeal for it has just become the incredible power of the music. And in many ways, I think the choruses are phenomenal.
How many times have I had to stand up in a concert hall every time it comes along just because King George stood up at the first performance? He was very struck by it, and I suppose it's a great tribute to Handel that a king would get up so impressed by it. But in fact, it is a great tune. And it is very stirring. And as many performances as I've heard of the Hallelujah Chorus, it never fails to put tingles up and down my spine. I'm not proud of it. I'm not entirely happy that it happens. I don't like to be gotten at so easily by an 18th century composer. But it works. And it obviously works for other people too.
People who never listen to an ounce of classical music will go to see Messiah every Christmas. And, you know, it's not Christmas unless they go to Messiah. So I think history has shown us that Messiah is one of the pieces that will probably last forever and go on forever and be performed forever. And I mean, as a performer, I love to perform it. I think it's rewarding to everyone, whether it be the people in the choir, the chorus members, or the soloists, or the people in the orchestra. I mean, I've sung it now how many times, but every time it seems new and exciting. So I think that's, for me, certainly, I think Messiah would probably be one of the main things for which Handel would be remembered.
The Messiah's phenomenal popularity has tended to overshadow Handel's other famous pieces within his great body of work. But being known for one defining piece of music is a cross many great composers throughout history have had to bear.
It's like the fingerprint for us normal beings. You know, we're recognized just by the fingerprints that we have. The fingerprints for these composers were these exceptional works. I mean, truly, truly, truly exceptional works, which they created. And that's healthy. It's not unhealthy. I think it's a perfectly natural reaction.
I think that our culture, we just sort of need to have something to identify somebody with. Somehow it hasn't happened with Shakespeare, has it? There's not one play that stands out as by far the most famous. It's curious, isn't it? But it seems to be the way with music. Somehow we get stuck on one work, and people like what they know, and they know what they like, and they want to hear what's familiar.
You know, I think every composer would love to be remembered for the magnificent body of work that they leave behind, but I'd settle for having one piece remembered. And I think that it's important to remember how many good composers there are and how few great ones there are. Good music we don't need. We need great music. So to hit it once in one piece, that would be okay with me.
And like all these other great composers, who are much more than just one-hit wonders, there's much more to Handel. During Handel's performance of the royal fireworks for King George I, the grand outdoor stage he and his orchestra were performing on accidentally caught on fire. It seems that someone, with rather poor aim, had prematurely set off the fireworks during the middle of the performance. Handel, known for his fiery temper, was more upset about the musical interruption than the threat to his life.
he had a sense of the value of his music to people. And I think that when things didn't work out in a performance, he got very annoyed. This is almost a romantic attitude. It's an unusual thing to encounter for an 18th century gentleman in a wig. But Handel was a very proud composer, and he knew what it meant to be George Frideric Handel, and he also knew how much less important it was to be a firework.
Handel's greatest gift to the world is undoubtedly the Messiah. His greatest gift to music was setting the highest standard for the dramatic oratorio. He never married. He loved to eat and drink, was fiercely independent, swore proficiently in several languages, and dominated classical music in England for decades. He was a colorful man who led a colorful life and was well aware of his greatness. Once, when colleagues tried to console him over an empty theater for one of his concerts, Handel responded, "Never mind, the music will sound better."